All right, Rand, two down, three to go. Let's make our way to Happy Valley. I think they should rename that with all the losing that Penn State does. That's just a shot at producer Sharon, who's a Penn State alum. Let's talk about Drew Allar. I like Penn State. I lived in Pittsburgh for a while. I appreciate the middle of that state. And here's a funny situation, perhaps. My comp, and we were talking about this player, former Penn State quarterback during the break, but my comp for Drew Allar is a more athletic Kerry Collins. I think there's Jacob Eason in there, but thinking more along the lines of what Jacob Eason I hoped he would have turned out to become coming out of Washington after transferring from Georgia. But Drew Allar, 6'5", almost 240. I got a first round grade on him. He's 20 years old too, so he's similar in age to Lenore Sellers. And like I said, I'm glad he came back to school. There was some conversation last year in January, and I'm sure you remember it, Ran, where that he might have thought about coming out had he done a little better down the stretch. That Notre Dame game was a tough one for Penn State. Threw 3 interceptions in that game, but he played pretty well over the last month or so of the season prior to that. But I was happy he came back. I'm glad he didn't force it. Big arm. He's a better athlete than I think people give him credit for. He can win in space with his legs, and I just think he needs to refine some of the things that he struggled with, whether it was getting through those reads, whether it was just accuracy or interceptions that felt like unforced errors. But I think there's a lot of room for growth. That said, you build a quarterback, walking out of the lab, he looks like Drew Allar.
Yeah, my comp form was a young Joe Flacco. When Flacco was coming out, it reminded me of. I think Flacco's arm is much stronger. Flacco kind of, back in those days fell into that category we talked about yesterday of having that either excellent or rare arm strength. But going back to what we talked about in the previous segment, this guy has the prototypical size that you look for, like you said, 6'5", around the 240 range, maybe slightly below. But he throws with touch. He can drop the ball in the bucket. But again, when you talked about the process, and I think the more he has to process, I thought he was a little bit mechanical, working through his progressions, rushing his feet, which caused his accuracy to wane at times. So, for the most part, and he had the game where he had 3 interceptions, but I thought he took pretty good care of the ball and didn't force the ball that much into pressure. Now, the one thing for him, and it's kind of unfortunate, is the offense he plays in at Penn State is not going to allow him to put up the gaudy numbers of some of these other quarterbacks that we've talked about. And it's just the system and the style of play that they have at Penn State. But, I like this kid. I think he's talented. I think he has all the physical traits and tools. And there are some people that have him as QB1 just based off of the physical traits. However, I think, again, this is why I compared him to Joe Flacco, to a young Joe Flacco. I think he is the guy that you're going to have to build around. You can win with him if you build around him and give him a strong supporting cast. Because if I'm being honest, the receivers that he was throwing to at Penn State, I didn't see as a great supporting cast that he was throwing to. And, they've had a strong running game, and they've had those talented backs, which we'll be talking about at a later date. But I think he's a guy that you're going to have to build around if you want him to be successful.
I'm glad you mentioned the wide receivers, because any Penn State fan will tell you this, that the wide receivers last year were, for lack of a better word, lacking. And even I went back and watched some of his throws against Oregon in the playoffs. He had 2 interceptions in that game. And you would like your wide receivers to do a little bit more in trying to not let those interceptions happen, because even though the quarterback gets dinged for interceptions, no matter how tip ball or otherwise, or terrible throw, it just felt like they weren't consistently getting open, and that's no newsflash. And that outside of Warren, the tight end, it was tough sledding consistently when pushing the ball down the field. They got my guy from Syracuse, Trevor Pena, so he's going to be a slot skill position player that's going to be consistently open. He reminds me a little bit of Xavier Restrepo, and they went toe-to-toe when Syracuse and the U faced off last November. So that'll be some help there. So we'll see what that looks like. But Penn State, they have dudes. They have dudes every year. They're going to have dudes on both sides of the ball. I'll ask you this, though, about Drew Allar, and I think you mentioned this either about Drew or maybe another quarterback, and I can't remember the context, but if you have a dude who's going to be a first-round pick at quarterback, wouldn't it make sense to give him more responsibility offensively, even if that's not necessarily what you do? Or does that lead to questions if you're an evaluator trying to figure out why this player isn't being asked to do these things?
Well, so it's one of those things, and I'm trying to figure out how exactly I want to say this. If you're the Penn State program, right, your job is to win games for Penn State. right? And not necessarily care about a guy's draft status. Now, I remember there was a time at Florida when Tim Tebow was coming out and everyone was talking about the Tim Tebow throwing motion and how he needed to tweak that. And Florida made some wholesale changes just in the building alone to build things to and get technology to help Tim, with his throwing motion. And I think that kind of took away from the overall use of the program, right? So if you're Coach Franklin, if you're the Penn State program, are you more dead set on getting this guy drafted, or are you more dead set on winning games for Penn State? That's all. That's the, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of how I see this whole thing. Like, your job is to win games for Penn State. I mean, it's kind of like what Georgia Tech did back in the day. You had Megatron, you had Demaryius Thomas, and you're running a triple option. You know what I mean? Like, because you did what you knew that was going to help you win games, and both of those guys still got drafted in the first round and had storied careers. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword, if you will.
Yeah, and I understand that part of it, and that's an important point. You're not there this isn't the minor leagues, and you don't have a connection with a Major League Baseball team because they own you. You're a college program that's independent of all that. But I think the frustration when you talk to some Penn State fans is that when it's go time and January football and you're still playing conservatively in the third quarter and you're punting on 4th and 1 at the other team's 38-yard line and you still have Drew Allar back there, that's where some of those frustrations come in. But, fans are not going to be happy no matter what. If Drew Allar threw the ball 85 times a game, I'm sure some fans would not be happy with that as well. But I think as a 20-year-old, if he continues to build on what he did last year, I think that's encouraging. One of the other conversations we've talked about is that when you have quarterbacks who played a lot in college, you have a sense of who they're going to be. But we talked about Lenore Sellers and Anthony Richardson before him. Have you seen enough of Drew Allar to be comfortable with drafting him if he puts up similar type numbers next season, or do you need to see a pretty substantial growth in certain areas to make you feel good about making him a top 15, top 20 pick?
Again, and it all goes back to what position you're looking at drafting him at. Like, if you're thinking about making him a top 5 pick, you need to see that one trait where he's going to lift the program, lift the organization. Like, he's going to be the reason why you win, and not just a part of why you win. Those, to me, are the guys that we talked about yesterday that have to be the franchise quarterback, if you will. If he continues to play like he did, like you said, he's 20 years old, which is encouraging because he's going to grow. But at some point, if you've played 20 plus, 23 plus games or so in the league, I mean, in college, and you kind of been consistent in your style of play, that might be who you are. And you might have to accept that regardless of what the physical traits say. Again, having a conversation with someone I respect, greatly in this league, one of the best evaluators I've ever been around, and Alonzo Highsmith, and we were talking yesterday about the quarterback position. And he was like, forget all the physical tools. The quarterback position is played from the neck up. And if they don't have that, then regardless of what the physical tools are, they're never going to maximize. And I tend to agree with him.
Yep. And we talked about in the last podcast that the media side can watch and see whether a guy can throw the ball or catch the ball or tackle. But at certain positions, quarterback in particular, it is so much more important that above the neck, you understand what needs to happen. You can handle disappointment because there's going to be a lot of it in the NFL, no matter who you are, and sort of figure that out.